This is K.M. Wyland, and you are listening to the 446th episode of the Helping Writers Become Authors podcast. I've been plugging away at my first edit of Dreambreaker. As you may remember, on this edit, I'm focusing on trimming word count. As all my books always seem to do, the first draft turned out to be longer than I was hoping, at 220,000 words. So I'm hoping to cut at least 20,000 in this first pass. Fortunately, that gives me the opportunity to do double duty by also focusing on tightening up sentences, eliminating unnecessary wordiness that might otherwise go unnoticed, and cutting out the occasional telling info dump that has sneaked through. My writing schedule has been all up in the air, as I'm still putting things back together after a big move, but I hope to finish with this in another couple of weeks. And in the meantime, I hope you enjoy today's topic, Words Are Radical, or How to Cherish Language. Years ago, I was hiking with someone around the Scottsbluff National Monument in western Nebraska. A bird flew over our heads, black, against a metallic July sky. A lover of all things beautiful, my hiking partner was the first to point it out. I shaded my eyes and said, "Cool, what do you think it is?" And he shrugged and said, "Don't ask that. It diminishes it if you name it. If you have to put it in a box to understand it, you limit your understanding." He seemed to have a point, and his comment was something I considered for a long time after that day, before realizing I completely disagreed with it. Even today, I'm not sure what that bird was. I remember it as a black blob against the sky. I remember the feeling it gave me, seeing it floating lazily on a thermal, but I don't actually remember the bird. If I'd recognize the bird as a vulture or a bald eagle or a red-winged hawk, then I have a feeling I'd remember him. This is the value of language. Indeed, we might even say language is a value system. By its very nature, it assigns value to all the pieces of our life, and by extension, to life itself. All humans interact with language on some level or another. But as writers, no one is more intimately responsible for cherishing, protecting, and propagating language than we are. Statistician Ben Blatt highlighted some interesting insights when he mated words and numbers in the studies that created his book Nabokov's Favorite Word is Mauve. Using algorithms to recognize and observe patterns in hundreds of stories, everything from centuries of classics to reams of bestseller lists to entire libraries of fanfic sites, he examined a number of curious trends within the history of literature. He looked at everything from authors' most used words, wonder what Nabokov's was, to phrasal differentiation between male and female writers, to the prevalence of cliches, to the likelihood of authors following their own writing advice. All were fascinating, but what struck me most was his chapter Guiltier Pleasures, which examined the readability level of bestsellers over the years. I doubt his findings elicited great surprise from any quarter. What he found was a distinct trend away from big words and long sentences toward quote-unquote easier prose. Since reading is a learned skill with decided levels of proficiency, it makes perfect sense that the most popular books will always be those most accessible to the broadest reading base. It doesn't necessarily mean quote-unquote easy books are better or worse than quote-unquote advanced books. It just means more people are likely to read them. As far as it goes, that's all to the good. What, in my opinion, is not so much to the good is the danger inherent in this trend of losing our language. Language lost isn't just sad for those of us who love words and who want to let rip with a good old somniloquent now and then without having the flesh readability alarm suddenly go berserk on us. It's disturbing because when we lose words, we lose more than just the ability to comprehend what we're reading. We also lose a little bit of our ability to comprehend life itself. And I have to say, it's a little telling that I just had to tell my Chrome browser to add somniloquent to its dictionary. And here's another word Chrome doesn't seem to know: hypocognition. In all fairness, I didn't know it either until I read Katie Wu and David Dunning's insightful Scientific American post, Unknown Unknowns: The Problem of Hypocognition. Basically, hypocognition is simply all the stuff you don't know. If, like me, you didn't know what hypocognition was, that's hypocognition. Although hypocognition encompasses more than just an ignorance of terminology, words, or the lack thereof, is decidedly at its heart. Wu and Dunning shared, consider this. How well can you discern different shades of blue? If you speak Russian, Greek, Turkish, Korean, or Japanese, your chances are much better than if you speak English. The former groups have two distinctive linguistic representations of blue. In Russian, for example, dark blue, sini, and light blue, yalubo, are as distinct as red and pink. But in English, we know blue as a single concept. The deprivation of finer-grained color concepts poses a great perceptual disadvantage. English speakers more easily confuse blue shades, not because we have poorer vision, but because we lack the more granular distinctions in the language we speak. We can see the crossover here with the Bader-Meinhof phenomenon, which, as Alan Bellows explains, as the experience where one stumbles upon some obscure piece of information, often an unfamiliar word or name, and soon afterwards encounters the same subject again, often repeatedly. For example, I need to buy a car. In my research, I discovered that the Kia Soul seems to land on all the top 10 review lists for its class. I'd never heard of the Soul before. I barely even registered Kia on my radar. But now, suddenly, Kia Souls are everywhere. 3 in the same row at the grocery store on the same morning. It wasn't, however, the prevalence of the Souls that suddenly changed. It was my knowledge of the car's existence and my subsequent ability to name it. Of course, I'd seen a Soul before, but because I had no language for it, it slid right through my awareness as if it didn't even exist. In short, you can't notice what you notice until you notice it. Language is one of the easiest and most powerful ways to notice not just life's concrete aspects, but also the abstract. Wu and Dunning again. Hypocognition also lies in the muddle of emotional experiences that we encounter but fail to explicate. We are hypocognitive amidst the rumbling moments of frustration when we are at a loss for words to describe how we feel. If there's any consolation, we look to other cultural worlds to acquire an emotional lexicon that acknowledges these emotions. Ever felt the unspoken but mutual desire when looking into a loved one's eyes? That's mamila pan tapiai in the Chilean Yagan language. Ever felt the irresistible urge to pinch a baby's cheek? That's gijil in Tagalog. Now, I'm a namer, and I don't just mean naming things like George the spider, who currently lives in my desk plant. I mean that if I'm going to be able to understand things, I first need to be able to name them, to explain them. Partly this is just how my brain works. It's a constant battle up there between vague intuitions and loud delineations. Certainly this is why I believe true mastery is found in a conscious application of unconscious skill. It's also why writing this blog and this podcast has been the single best tool for helping me improve my own writing. Being forced to put my ideas, theories, and understandings about storytelling into words other people can understand helps me understand them better than I ever would otherwise. This compulsion to name is also undoubtedly why I am so deeply attracted to words. In my teens, I kept a folded piece of legal paper in the front of whatever book I was reading. When I found a word I didn't know, I would save it on the paper. Later, I would look it up, write down its definition in a special notebook, then underline the word in the dictionary. Whenever I ran into an underlined word in the future, I'd always reread it. Perhaps regrettably, Kindles and mobile phones now make all that effort unnecessary. These days, I sometimes find myself wanting to put my finger on an unknown word in a paperback book, forgetting it won't immediately give me a pop-up definition. Even still, I've always been thankful for the time and the many notebooks I used to immerse myself in words. I know what things are because of those words. Not as many things as I'd like to know, but more than I would have known. If words are names, then writing is the art of naming. Indeed, I think storytelling is perhaps one of the most expansive human efforts to name our experiences and even our very existence. In her phenomenal affirmation of the writing life, Walking on Water, Madeleine L'Engle talked about how the true danger inherent in losing our words is the subsequent loss of our ability to use our stories to name. From her vantage point in 1972, she wrote, "I am a storyteller, and that involves language, for me, the English language, that wonderfully rich, complex, and oftentimes confusing tongue. When language is limited, I am thereby diminished too. In time of war, language always dwindles, vocabulary is lost, and we live in a century of war. When I took my elder daughter's 10th grade vocabulary cards up to the school from which she had graduated, less than a decade after she had left, the present 10th grade students knew almost none of them. It was far easier for my daughter to read Shakespeare in high school than it was for students coming along just a few years after her. This diminution is worldwide. In Japan, after the Second World War, so many written characters were lost that it is difficult, if not impossible, for the present-day college students to read the works of the classic masters." As even Blatt's cursory research into the bestseller lists shows, we live in a culture that is not only moving away from quote-unquote high language, but even denigrating it. Intricate language and specific words are often discouraged in classes and even in some formal publications. Accessibility is king. Nothing wrong with that. George Orwell's "never use a long word where a short one will do" remains sound advice. But perhaps the better rule is the one that tells us always choose the right word. To do that, writers have the responsibility of first learning the right words and then using them. Not only is this good writing, it might even be one of the most poignant contributions we can make to a better world. Is that melodramatic? Maybe, but I tend to believe it's true. L'Engle went on to talk about simple word choice as a radical act of courage. She said, "We cannot name or be named without language. If our vocabulary dwindles to a few shop-worn words, we are setting ourselves up for takeover by a dictator. When language becomes exhausted, our freedom dwindles. We cannot think, we do not recognize danger, injustice strikes us as no more than the way things are. And writers become suspect because people who use words are able to work out complex ideas, to see injustice, and perhaps even to try to do something about it." This is not a challenge to cram as many 5-syllable words as possible into your rom-com or historical thriller. It's definitely not a challenge to shove your impressive vocabulary down your ignorant readership's throats. Rather, this is a challenge to each of us to discover our world through language. It is a challenge to learn the specific names of the things and ideas and emotions that create life all around us. It is a challenge to us, particularly as writers, to share the names we've learned and share them rightly and appropriately as the building blocks in the even greater act of naming that is storytelling itself. It is a challenge to push back our own ignorance with understanding. If we do that, perhaps we are then able to reach out and help others push as well. So tell me what you think. How do you think being a writer has enhanced your ability to cherish language? If you'd like to be a part of the fabulous word player community over on my site and join in the conversation on this subject, be sure to stop by the website at helpingwritersbecomeauthors.com. If you're interested in reading a transcript of this most recent podcast and adding your voice to the discussion by visiting the first post on this site's homepage. And don't forget that if you're looking for an older post, you can always find those by putting the podcast title in the search field at the top of the right-hand column. If you enjoyed this podcast, you can subscribe on iTunes. And if you'd like to support Helping Writers Become Authors, I would totally appreciate it if you'd consider taking the time to leave just a quick rating or review on iTunes. Thank you so much for listening to the Helping Writers Become Authors podcast, and be sure to check back again next week.